Proverbs 28, verses 1 through 14, the overall counsel is that if you don't fear God, you'll always live in fear. He starts in verse 1 with a wicked person who does not fear God, and they're always on the run. They're looking over their shoulder, afraid of getting caught. They're like fugitives who cannot rest, and they're so afraid of being found out. It borders on paranoia. They flee when no one is even pursuing them. But the righteous who fear God have nothing to fear from man. He's not being pursued. He's not worried about being caught because he's followed the Lord and hasn't done anything wrong. And notice he closes this section in verse 13 with someone who is afraid to confess their sins. They live in fear of someone finding out how sinful they are, and so they keep it a secret for fear of how people will react. But the righteous who confesses his sins finds forgiveness and compassion. And he finishes in verse 14 by saying, how blessed is the man who fears always, but he who hardens his heart will fall into calamity. He's talking about a man who fears God always. If you fear God, you don't have to live your life in fear because we have nothing to hide, nothing to run from. If we do sin, we confess it. And even if something terrible happens to us in this life, we know we're right with God in the end and have nothing to fear on the other side of the grave. On the other hand, wickedness always breeds fear, both in ourselves because of our guilty conscience, but also in those around us in society because it makes society an unsafe place to live. In verse 2, he says, by the transgression of a land, many are its princes, but by a man of understanding and knowledge, so it endures. The more evil your land is, the more rulers you need to keep order. You need a complex bureaucracy to try to keep the citizenry safe. But unfortunately, a lot of the times the rulers are evil too. So the more evil the land is, the more rulers you need, and the more evil rulers you need, the more evil the land becomes. And it's a terrifying situation for the citizens. In fact, in verse 12, he says, when the righteous triumph, there is great glory, but when the wicked rise, men hide themselves. So if a wicked person rises to power and is one of these princes over the land, that causes the citizenry to live in fear. But if, on the other hand, in the second part of verse 2, you've got a wise ruler, a man of understanding and knowledge, he can actually lead the citizenry to be righteous and to be people of understanding and knowledge too, which allows the land to endure in safety and to flourish in the fear of the Lord. In verse 3, sometimes there are poor people who are so afraid of staying poor that they oppress their fellow poor people. Why? Because this person lives in fear of not having enough, and he doesn't care what he has to do to make money, even if it means oppressing someone just like him. And in so doing, he's like a driving rain, which floods out the crops and destroys people's harvest. Usually rain is good for your crops, but sometimes if there's too much of it, it can destroy them. Likewise, a poor person, you would think, would be like a refreshing rain to other poor people, because if anyone would have compassion on them, it would be him. And yet he destroys them instead. In verse 4, those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law strive with them. In other words, those who don't fear God are afraid of wicked people, and to stay on their good side, they make sure to praise them and to flatter them and to suck up to them. But those who fear God are not afraid of man and are willing to stand up to them and confront their wickedness and tell them the way that they're living isn't right. And in verse 5, if we don't fear God, we'll have a twisted view of justice, and usually it will mean as long as we get ours, then justice has been served. But that comes from living in fear that things won't work out for us. And so we need to pervert justice in order to protect ourselves and secure our future. In verse 6, sometimes rich people are crooked because they're afraid of losing their riches. But if a poor person has integrity, he doesn't live in fear and doesn't need to compromise his morals for fear that he won't have enough. In verse 7, someone who doesn't fear the Lord becomes a companion of gluttons, probably out of fear of being alone, and he just wants friends, and it doesn't matter whether these friends are good for him or not. He just wants to belong and to fit in and to be cool and popular, and it actually humiliates his father. And in verse 8, there are rich people who live in fear of not having enough, and so they charge people interest and usury, which is excessive and exploitative interest. And yet God will find a way to make sure sure they do not prosper in the long run. In fact, he'll reverse their exploitation and find a way for all the money they made to go to the righteous instead. Now, it's hard to know exactly how this works practically, but it could be that this rich, exploitative man makes a business deal with a righteous man. And so any money he spends buying the products or services of this righteous man, that righteous man goes and uses it to help the poor. So even though the rich man is exploiting the poor, God reverses it in his economy and makes sure that that money somehow gets back to the poor who have been exploited. In verse 9, this is a person who doesn't really fear the Lord, but he might fear not having God on his side as an insurance policy. And so he has no interest in obeying God, but he wants to pray to make sure to keep God on his good side. But this person is always going to live in fear. Number one, for having a guilty conscience because he knows he's not living right. And number two, from having no real confidence that God is with him. He can tell himself that he's right with God all he wants because of his prayers, but he knows in his heart he's distant from the Lord because he's not living right, and therefore he's going to live in fear. In verse 10, there are evil people who lead others astray, and the righteous do not have to live in fear that they'll be led astray too, because they're confident in their relationship with God, and they don't have to live in fear of falling into the pit of an evil influencer. And in verse 11, the rich are too prideful to admit that they live in fear. In fact, a lot of times they don't feel any fear at all because their riches and their wisdom gives them a sense of security. But a poor man can see what's really going on in this rich man's life, that he's trying to compensate for the fear in his heart by having a huge bank account, thinking that is going to make him safe, when in reality, because he doesn't fear God, he has to live in fear. And when he's on his deathbed, his money won't do anything to take his fear of God away. The truth is, we either fear God now or we fear God later. And if you fear God now, you don't have to fear him later. But if you only fear him later, then there's nothing but fear left. And so the challenge for us is to realize if we're living in fear of what people say about us and think about us or do to us, or if we're living in fear that we won't have enough, it's a sign that we don't fear God enough. Jesus said in Matthew 10, verse 28, "Do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." Jesus understands if we fear God, then we will not fear man and what they can do to us. And he also knows we won't live in fear of not having enough, because in the next few verses, Jesus says, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a cent? And yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered, so do not fear. You are more valuable than many sparrows." He's setting up this hierarchy of fear. And if our greatest fear is for God, then all the lesser fears of life, like what people think of us, or what's going to happen in the future, and will I lose my job, and will I be alone and never find anybody to marry, and will I get some sickness or disease and die an early death, all of those fears will be put in proper perspective. And it doesn't mean we won't feel any fear at all, but it does mean we'll have the courage to face those fears because we'll face them with God on our side, knowing that no matter what happens to us, if we're right with him, we will be okay. And this points to Christ, because one of the major problems Jesus faced in his earthly ministry is people who feared man rather than God. People were afraid to associate themselves with Jesus for fear of what others might think about them. Even Peter gave into this in the courtyard when Jesus was arrested, and a servant girl says, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" And he denies 3 times that he even knows him, because in the moment he feared man more than he feared God. And by contrast, this is what makes Jesus so amazing, is that he feared God more than he feared crucifixion and scourging and social shame and humiliation, and more than he feared losing his own life. He felt no need to hide in shame because he was innocent and his conscience was clear, so he could live and die with the boldness of a lion. And because of it, like it says in Proverbs 28 in verse 12, the righteous triumphed, and there was great glory and rejoicing among the righteous. So as we call on God for wisdom today, our prayer is, Father, help me fear you more than I fear anyone or anything else in this life. I don't want to live in fear. I want to live in boldness and confident faith that I'm right with you. Because if I'm right with you in Christ, there's no one and nothing that can make me live in fear.